Right, should we start? Great, thanks all for coming. This is the last annual of this academic year, so nice to see people. And it's my real pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Professor Katie Slocombe from University of York. So Katie works on communication and social cognition across species and the development of those, and basically the extent to which there are underlying similar mechanisms across different species of communication. And she's been doing some great work in chimps in the wild and their communication. And I heard Katie's talk at SNL, so this is Society for Neurobiology of Language, so this is one of the main, well, the main conference in our field a couple of years back, and it was across 3 days, lots of talks. I thought her talk was hands down the best talk of the conference, and I thought it'd be great if she could come and talk to us about her work. So here we are, and I'm very much excited to hear about it.
Amazing. Thank you so much for such a kind introduction, and thank you all very much for coming to listen today. So today I'm going to try and talk a little bit about the importance of trying to scratch beneath the surface and try and look at the cognitive mechanisms that are underpinning communication in PAN, so chimpanzees and bonobos, and we're going to be looking specifically at intentions, representations and joint attention. Okay, so to give you an overview of the talk, I'm going to start just by explaining why I think looking at chimpanzees and bonobos can help us to understand the evolution of our own communication system, language. And then specifically look at a type of signal that is very important to our linguistic system, which is referential signals. And so then within that, I'm going to look at functionally referential calls in our closest living relatives, and we're going to look at it from two perspectives. So first of all, the call production perspective, and asking the question about intentions. So when chimpanzees produce alarm calls, is that a reflexive response to something that they're really scared of, or are they doing that more intentionally to communicate with others? Then we're going to look at the receiving side and look at call perception in a language competent bonobo, Kanzi, and ask if calls from other bonobos elicit mental representations, and if they do, what's the nature of those mental representations? So are those object-based or are those emotion-based? And then we're going to change tack a little bit and move away from kind of direct communication, and we're going to look at an aspect of social cognition that we know is really important in underpinning language acquisition in our species, and that is joint attention. And we're going to ask the question as to whether that's uniquely human, so I'll be presenting some data on that question. Okay, so let's start then with a comparative approach to language evolution. So I'm sure you'll all agree, language is an immensely complex and amazing capacity that we have as humans. It allows us to communicate about things that have happened in the past, things that are going to happen in the future, and it allows us to share things that are only occurring within our own minds. And because we are the only species with language, trying to understand how this ability evolved is a real puzzle. But one powerful way of approaching this problem is to break language down and say, okay, what are all the constituent parts needed that together in humans come together to form language, and try and trace the evolutionary pathways of each of those components. And when taking a comparative approach, if we focus in on other primates, and particularly our closest living relatives, we're able to search for homologous traits. So we're able to try and estimate what our last common ancestors, which may or may not have looked like this individual, might have been capable of. What kind of communication system was present 5 to 7 million years ago? And so the logic is that if we find an aspect of communication that's shared by us and the PAN species, chimpanzees and bonobos, that we're equally closely related to, then the inference is that the last common ancestor likely also had that trait. Now, of course, this is still only an estimate. Until we can build a time machine and go back and study that individual in situ, we won't know for sure. But it's one of the best ways we have of estimating what that last common ancestor might have been capable of doing with its mind and its communication, because those things rarely leave a physical imprintation on the world. Okay, so that's why broadly I'm interested in studying these species. And then within language, one of the things that my work has focused on a lot is then the evolution of referential signals within language. And so I love this quote from Daniel Dennett, who said, "Semantics, it's where the rubber meets the road, where language gets all the way into the world and words refer to things and events therein." And it's an absolutely fundamental part of our language and of the ability to communicate with individuals about things out there in the world. And so my question then is, what are the evolutionary origins of this, of these referential signals that permeate so extensively our linguistic system? And so back in the 1960s, Thomas Strussacher noticed that vervet monkeys were seen to be giving different calls to different predators. And then in the 1980s, Robert Seyfarth and Dorothy Cheney then followed that up with playback experiments, which showed that alarm calls in vervet monkeys met the kind of criteria for being functionally referential calls. And so those criteria are that the call has to be given reliably to a specific external event or object. So in this case, the arrival or the detection of a specific predator type. But the other aspect to that you need the playback experiments for is that the listeners need to respond to calls of group members given in response to that thing in a similar way to the way that they would respond if they experienced that event themselves. So in the case of an alarm call, when you hear an alarm call, you need to respond in a similar way to that alarm call as you would to the predator itself. And that's, if we get a call system that meets those criteria, we're labelling those calls as functionally referential. And the reason that they're functionally referential, not just referential calls, is because people were agnostic as to the cognitive mechanism that was underpinning the production and reception of these calls. So on the surface, it's functioning as our referential signals do, but it was purposefully agnostic about what was underpinning those types of calls. So since that seminal work on the vervet monkeys, we know that many other alarm calling systems function referentially. So Klaus Zuberbühler's work on the Western African arboreal monkeys, such as Diana monkeys and Campbell monkeys. And it expands outside of primates as well. So we also know that chickens and meerkats have some really complex ways of communicating about predators. But the other type of functionally referential call that we see a lot in the primate literature is food calls. So predators and food seem to be two very salient external events that these animals are communicating about. And so there's evidence that bonobos, chimpanzees and marmosets have functionally referential food calls, which give varying amounts of kind of specificness of information to their listeners. So some just label the presence of food. In the chimpanzees, it seems to label the value and potentially the type of food. And in bonobos, again, it seems to be a value. So they can distinguish between high value food and low value food. Okay, so though that's a quick whistle stop tour of functionally referential calls, but if we actually start to think, okay, so we're highlighting these because we think they might be the building blocks for, or similar to, our own referential signals. But are the cognitive mechanisms that underpin the production of these in non-humans actually similar to those in humans? And so there are loads of questions to ask. There are many more than the ones I'm going to put on, but these are some of the ones I've tried to address in kind of my work. And so if we look from the perception point of view, from the listeners, are the responses that listeners give to these functionally referential calls innate? Are they conditioned through experience? Or are they mediated by mental representations? And if there's evidence for mental representations, what form do they take? So for instance, if we hear this bonobo alarm call, oh, hang on, no, that's going to have to be played. Is a listening bonobo, does it have an object-based representation, say of a snake or another threat? Or does it have an emotion-based representation, maybe of the fear level of the individual that produced that call? And at the moment, so this is one of the things I'm going to try and present on today, but very little research is there in this area. And then if we look from the production side of things, again, lots of questions we don't know the answers to. So are calls produced intentionally, as we produce language intentionally? And I'll go into a little bit more detail about what I mean about intentionality, but kind of broadly, I mean that they're under voluntary control, they're flexible, and they're directed at specific individuals. Do they intend to inform their audience about the external events that they're calling about? And do they have any flexible control over the acoustic structure of the calls that they produce? Now, I can't tell the answers to the kind of all of these questions today that we've tried to tackle, but we're going to focus in on some of them. And the one that we're going to start with is the intentionality of the call production. And so our question here focused in on chimpanzee alarm calls, and we wanted to know whether the production of these calls meets the criteria for first order intentionality. So just a little bit, so before I explain more how we operationalised kind of what is intentional communication, just to give you a broad overview of how chimpanzees communicate about threat. So chimpanzees they have a graded call system, so all of their calls kind of grade into other call types. And so in an alarm context, they give 3 calls that grade into each other. So they're called soft whoos, and this is a very soft recording, so you may or may not be able to hear this. Oh, sorry, we'll just go back and see if we can get the soft who again. So it's a very call. That then grades into alarm whoos, which are longer and have more of a kind of a dip in the intonation, and then followed by wah barks. So they're the call types that we're interested in. But our question is, why do they give these calls when they encounter a threat? So is it just that they're frightened and it's an automatic kind of reflexive response to encountering something that they're frightened of? And that would be a zero order intentional kind of explanation for the alarm calling. Or are they intentionally produced maybe to protect others from danger or to get others to come to mob a predator if that's appropriate for that predator type? And that would be first order intentionality, so being produced to change the behaviour of others that you're directing the calls at. And so just a little detour then into how we're going to operationalise intentionality. It's a very slippery kind of word to use. Lots of different disciplines use this word, and it means something different to everybody. But the key question that we wanted to ask was, how can we distinguish between this zero order intentionality, where it's just a readout of emotion and arousal, versus something that's under more intentional control and it's directed at individuals to change their behaviour? And worked together with Simon Townsend and colleagues, we suggested 3 criteria, and I'm going to focus on 2 of those today. So the first one is that if a signal is given with this first order intentionality, it should be goal directed. So how do we know if a signal is goal directed? So the idea here is that we identify stopping rules. So the idea is that the signaller, if it's goal-directed, the signaller should persist or elaborate their signals until their goal is achieved. And so if you look at the point, if they're signalling and then at a certain point they stop, if you look at what has changed in their behaviour or the behaviour of others, you should be able to identify over numerous different occasions what are the similarities between the contexts, what's happening when they stop. So identifying the stopping rules is something that we tried to do. And then the second is that the signaller produces voluntary recipient-directed signals as a means to reach that goal. And how do we identify that? So here we borrow criteria from work that started on the pre-verbal behaviour of human infants and their gestures, and that then got adapted by people working with great ape gestures. So we were the first people to try and get these criteria and then apply them to the vocal domain in great apes. And so the ones that we could apply are social use. So you would expect that if a signal is given intentionally, you shouldn't be giving it when you're on your own. You should be giving it when there's a social audience. But perhaps more nuanced than that, you may not just blanket give it to everyone. You may choose to preferentially give it to individuals that you're friends with or that are particularly valuable for you. So different types of audience effects. You would also expect that if you are calling to change the behaviour of another individual, that you should be monitoring them. What are you doing? What are you doing before I call, during my call, after my call? So you should be checking in with them. And potentially in the case of referential communication, maybe gaze alternating between your directed recipient and maybe the object that you're trying to communicate about. So then there are two more that are related to visual attention, which is important if you're giving things, gestures in a visual domain. So sensitivity to the intentional state of recipients. Don't do this behind someone's back. And then or manipulating recipient attentional states. So maybe giving a tactile gesture before then giving a visual gesture. But those obviously don't apply to the auditory modality because you don't need the visual attention of an individual in order for them to receive an auditory signal from you. Okay, so taking those criteria then and trying to apply them to the chimpanzee alarm calling system, we did this work in the wild with the in the Budongo forest in Uganda. We were working with the Sonso community, which at that time numbered about 70 individuals. So just to give you kind of a brief introduction to chimpanzees in the wild, they work on a fission-fusion basis. So in the community of 70 individuals, we would never see all 70 individuals together. They're not like monkeys who kind of have a group and they waffle around in a group all day and might spread out a bit for foraging, but come back to sleep together at night. So they have a territory that's quite large, but within that territory, they're constantly changing who they're associating with. So you might get out of a nesting area, 10 chimps who've all nested together. They may split into a 5 and a 5. This 5 may then split into a 2 and a 3. This 5 might meet up with a 20 and become a 25 for a bit. And then we might get splitting of that. So they're constantly changing where they're going, which is, I think, is a driver probably for social complexity. It does make working with them slightly more challenging because you never know where any one individual is at any time. Okay, and this is the postdoctoral work of Anne Schell. It took her 2 years in the field to collect what is not very large number of trials, but she did an amazing job and showed real persistence to get these trials run. So our experimental design was we had a very realistic snake model. So the Ugandan Wildlife Centre in Entebbe donated us the skin of a python that had died in their care. So we had on kind of chicken wire, we had this very realistic python skin, and we attached to the python model piece of fishing wire so that we could try and get ahead of the chimps where we predicted they were going to travel, hide the snake under a load of leaves, get the wire out. A field assistant would then be sitting 10 metres away from the snake with the fishing wire, and then when our target individual approached the snake, when they were 2 metres away from it, the field assistant would give one sharp pull to reveal the snake, and at that point we would then have as many people as possible filming from as many angles to try and capture all of the behaviour, and we then stayed filming until the last individual left. And this method allowed us to reveal the snake to very specific individuals and manipulate the social context in which they saw the snakes. So we had 3 target conditions. So when the individual was alone, and then in 2 different social conditions, when they were both at the front of a group and when they were at the back of the group. In the end, we didn't really distinguish between the 2 types of social group. We analysed those together. And we managed to get 7 individuals who completed all 3 conditions in a within subjects design. And we managed to get 6 more individuals to complete a single condition. So as I said, it's a modest sample size, but it was exceptionally difficult to do this work because you can predict the direction of a chimp group all you like. You run ahead, get everything ready, and the field assistant with the chimpanzees is on the walkie-talkie, and then at some point he's like, yeah, we're still coming, we're about 100 metres away. Oh, we've just turned east, oh no, sorry, we're not coming anymore. So then you have to pack up the snake and get it moving and then move again and try and get ahead. So yeah, it was fairly rare, or our target individual moved from being the front or the back of the group, so then we didn't go ahead with the trial. Okay, so just to let you see what the kind of reactions looked like, this is a trial with Nambi, the alpha female, who encountered the snake originally on her own. And so you'll see her startle response and then her going bipedal and giving those soft hoos. And you'll hear the commentary from Anne.
Nambi seeing the snake, hooing, hooing, hooing.
And notice she's fixated on the snake whilst producing those calls. A little while later, her adult son Musa joins the party. So he has arrived from not being there when she discovered the snake. And you'll see here now she turns to look at him and then she gives some wah barks and some of those different calls. And he again goes bipedal before he can't possibly see the snake from where he is, but her calls are meaningful in a way that he understands what the threat is. Okay, oh, no. Okay, so we then analysed all the videos we collected from the trials and tried to address the first of those criteria about whether they're goal-directed signals. And so our idea was to kind of test two potential goals. So it could be that these calls are given for the benefit of others. So do chimpanzees call until all others are safe? And by safe, because pythons are ambush predators, you just need to be aware of where it is and essentially you are then safe from it. So in order to be safe, you needed to either be off the ground, out of striking distance, or you needed to have gone and bipedally checked it, or produced an alarm call, which again shows an awareness that you know there is a snake threat there. And so what we did is we looked at the behaviour 10 seconds after they stopped calling versus the rest of the trial. So that gave us like a chance level of this kind of particular behaviour occurring. And what we found was that when chimps stopped calling, in that 10 seconds after they stopped calling, recipients were significantly more likely to be safe than you would expect by chance from looking at the rest of the trial. So that was positive evidence that this seems to be a putative goal for the chimps. In comparison, we put that against a more selfish goal that maybe the chimpanzees are calling because they're frightened themselves about this predator they've seen, and essentially when they reduce their fear level by moving away from the snake, then maybe their arousal drops and that's why they stop calling. But we didn't find any support for that. So the caller was not more likely than chance to be moving away from the snake in that stopping period. So that was exciting that they seem to be goal-directed and they seem to be directed at others. So then what about the voluntary control and the directedness? So the first of those was social use. So what happens when they're on their own versus when they're in the social group? So 5 out of 7 individuals produce soft hoos, the ones, in immediate response to the snake, both when they were alone and in the social trials. So those seem to be more of an individualistic response of fear to seeing something scary. They don't seem to be socially directed. In contrast, alarm hoos and wah barks were just very, very rarely produced in that immediate response to the snake. So those seem to be calls that got made later in the trial and usually in response to other individuals arriving. So then let's look at social use, but in terms of the composition of the audience. So who is there and does that matter? So are the calls directed not just at any individual, but at specific individuals? And so for here, we looked at arrivals. So as I said, in a fission-fusion society, individuals arrive and leave at all kind of points. And we had 9 trials where new individuals joined the focals party and they hadn't been present when the snake had been discovered. And so we looked at what happened in the 30 seconds before and the 30 seconds after that arrival, with the idea that if calls are directed to the new arrivals, we should see an increase in calls from before to after. For the soft hoos, we didn't find this. So in only 87 kind of potential dyadic cases, did the soft hoo rates increase from before to after. So it looks like the soft hoos are not really directed at those new arrivals. In contrast, however, we do see an increase in the production of alarm hoos and wah barks, but that is mediated by who is arriving. So you're significantly more likely to increase your production of those calls if the individual arriving is a friend. So that's an individual that you engage in grooming with and you choose to spend time hanging out with. Okay, So positive evidence again here for alarm hoos and wah barks and not for soft hoos. So then let's think about monitoring who you're directing it at. What are you doing visually just before you're giving these calls? So where are they looking in the 5 seconds before they start a new call bound? And what we find here is that soft hoos are in blue, and looking at social stimuli means looking at another chimp or looking in the direction of calls of an individual that were just out of sight. And you can see that they're far more likely to look at social stimuli after giving an alarm hoo or a wah bark. Oh, you can't see my cursor. That's an error. Sorry, I'm here like wobbling on the screen. I'll point instead. So red and green are alarm hoos and wah barks, and you can see that they're significantly more likely to be looking at social stimuli before giving those call types than they are the soft hoos. What about gaze alternation? And so here we wanted to know, do chimps alternate their gaze between the snake and the recipient when they're calling? And so we looked just for a 2-part gaze alternation. So if you've been looking at the snake, do you then look at another individual and then call during kind of the 5 seconds around that switch of attention? And what we found is that 9 out of 12 of our focal individuals produced calling with gaze alternation, which is interesting. So that's comparable to the published gesture rates, which is a nice kind of cross-modal comparison. And critically, they showed higher rates of gaze alternation when they were calling than when they weren't calling, which again indicates that this is part of a communicative strategy and that they are directing these calls at specific individuals. So if we summarise what we've seen then across the different call types, so we've got soft hoos in the first row, alarm hoos, then wah barks. Soft hoos we don't really have a lot of evidence for being used intentionally, but alarm hoos and wah barks met all of the criteria that we could test them against. So we would argue that chimpanzee alarm hoo and wah barks have the hallmarks of first order intentional signals. I'd just like to flag, we have just completed very similar experiments with bonobos in the wild, and if we thought this was difficult with chimps, bonobos are even harder. And so Nicole Leif is currently trying to write those up for publication. I haven't got time to talk about it today, but we find some interesting cross-species similarities, but also some really interesting differences. So that's nice. Okay. So if we go back to our kind of questions about the cognitive mechanisms underpinning human language and animal functional reference, we've kind of addressed the intentional one for now. So we're now going to change track and look at the perception perspective and focus in on whether when individuals hear calls, that elicits a mental representation and what type of mental representation that elicits. So for this, as I said in the introduction, we worked with Kanzi, the language competent bonobo. So for those of you who don't know Kanzi, he's now a 44-year-old male bonobo living in captivity. He was raised in a mixed human bonobo environment. So he was raised in a very language-rich environment. And unlike the other language ape projects, he was not taught the symbol use through conditioning. That they used the symbols with him to do activities, to do joint things. So he learned and acquired these signals in a more similar way that human children learn language, to do things together. So he's got a very impressive vocabulary, and he has these arbitrary symbols which stand for different words. Most of them are referential in that they are kind of noun-based, but he also has emotional words and he also has action words. Okay, and so what our question was then was for Kanzi, when he hears alarm or food-associated calls produced by other bonobos, do those evoke mental representations that he could explicitly tell us about by matching them to kind of symbols that stand for certain things? And if so, are those object-based or emotion-based? And to do this study, we capitalised on the fact that Kanzi is extremely good at match-to-sample tasks. So he can just crack out 100 trials of this with no problem at all. He's very motivated. And so he's very good at matching spoken human words to the matching lexicograms. So this is him just to show.
Balloon.
gets a little food reward with the ta-da.
Apple.
Okay, so essentially what we did was we ran a very similar task with him, but we then interspersed the human word trials with bonobo call trials. And so, oh no, don't.
Balloon.
No, thank you. Sorry. So in terms of the stimuli that we gave him stimuli from individuals that he lived with in the group where we'd recorded them, but also unfamiliar individuals that lived in the wild that he'd never had contact with. And they were all calls given either to threats, so that could have been snakes, thunder, fireworks or gunshots, and then calls given by those same individuals to food. And we gave him just single calls in the first kind of iteration of what we did. So he had 4 different trial types. So in an alarm call trial, in an object-based trial, he would hear an alarm call given to a threat, which sounds like that in bonobos, and then he would get 3 lexicograms that would appear in a random place on his board. And for this, the object representation of that alarm call that would be correct would be snake. Then he would hear the same call, but this time his options would be the emotional related term, which would be scare. So this is a term that he used to label things that he was fearful of and that were scary. And then this kind of same idea then for the food associated calls. He would hear a food associated call, which sounds to the untrained ear somewhat like the alarm call, shorter, higher pitched. And again here then the correct match would be food, so that's his object-based representation. And then his emotion-based representation trials, he would then have surprise. So that was his word for a positive surprise, so whether that's a person he didn't know that was coming, a present, food enrichment, something that was kind of surprising and positive for him. That was his positive emotion word. Okay. So what do we find? So when he heard alarm calls, you can see from the table that whether he was familiar with the individual producing the call or not, he performed really well with this call type. So he was above chance, significantly above chance, matching these alarm calls to both scare and snake. However, he was better at matching them to scare than he was to snake, and the latency data also matches this. So he's also faster to match to scare than he is to snake. So although there seems to be a bias for the emotional kind of representation, it's clear that the calls elicit both types of representation in this specific bonobo, which is really awesome. Things did not go as we had expected, however, for the food-associated calls. So here, whether he knew the individuals or not, he was not above chance for any of the representations. So he couldn't match it to food and he couldn't match it to surprise. So that we then thought, well, okay, the original study by Zanna, Clay and Klaus Zuberbühler, where they showed that, food-associated calls function referentially and that individuals could use that information to understand the quality of food available to them. They had not played back single calls, they played back short sequences. So we thought, okay, we'll give them sequences then. So we made 3 call sequences. He was still not above chance. We then thought, well, just in case, even though he's really, maybe food is kind of it's a meta category, maybe he's having difficulty with that as the lexigram for it. So we also then tried just matching to photos rather than lexicograms. Made no difference. He still could not do it. And so whatever we did, his performance never shifted from chance. And so in stark contrast to the alarm-associated calls, food-associated calls did not seem to elicit a mental representation of either food or surprise in Kanzi. Okay, so if we go back to our kind of question about the differences in mechanisms underpinning animal functional reference and human reference, in terms of are the cognitive mechanisms similar, I think it's a really mixed picture. I think the answer is, well, sometimes yes. So we saw that alarm hoos and wah barks were given with first order intentionality, and alarm calls elicited both an object and an emotional representation in Kanzi. but also sometimes no. We had no real evidence that soft hoos were produced intentionally, and the food-associated calls didn't evoke mental representations that we could track in Kanzi. And I think it's also really important to point out that we still don't know. The research just hasn't been done for the vast majority of primate species and the vast majority of call types. So the evidence that we have at the moment, I would say, is really mixed, and it's also super patchy and generally just absent. So I think kind of my take-home message from this is that it's super important to continue with this line of work, to consider the psychological mechanisms underpinning both call production and reception in non-human primates, if we're really going to understand if similar communicative behaviours on the surface really are likely to be homologous. So that, I think, is the take-home message from that part. So let's change tack a little bit now. So that's the kind of part of the talk that focused on non-human primate communication. But now we're going to switch to the social cognition part of social cognition that we know is really, really important for language. And that is joint attention. So joint attention, so again, joint attention is a bit like intentionality. Lots of people use this term in wildly different ways in the literature. So when I talk about joint attention, I mean the coordination and sharing of attention about objects and events out there in the world. And in terms of its importance, Tomasello has highlighted joint attention as the small change that made a big difference in terms of our evolution. He would argue that it is one of the first building blocks of shared intentionality, which then supports our ability to cooperate and also have language as such a complex and cooperative form of communication. We also know that in terms of ontogeny, that joint attention predicts early vocabulary development, at least in Western samples. And so it seems to be a kind of a really important skill related to language, both from an evolutionary perspective, but also a developmental perspective. So let's just break it down a little bit further and be a bit more specific about what I do mean about joint attention. So for me, individuals have joint attention skills. And so this could be initiating joint attention. So this could be trying to get somebody else to pay attention to something out there in the world. So, maybe pointing at it or gaze alternating between the person and the individual that you wanted to look at would be ways, or actually physically grabbing someone and dragging them over and then kind of, getting them to approach the object. So anything that you do to kind of initiate sharing attention about something that's of interest to you. But you, as an individual, you also need to be sensitive to those initiating signals in others. So you need to be able to gaze follow and you need to be able to point follow accurately. So if you've got these skills and you're interacting with another individual with these skills, you would hope that this would then result in a joint attention event. So I'm just going to talk through what that might look like. So we might see an event where we've got Simon and he's seen a really cool star. So he's looking at the star and Harry uses his responding to joint attention skills to gaze follow when he looks at Simon and then also look at the star. So at this point, what we have is parallel attention between Harry and Simon on that star. However, for me, this is not a joint attention event because Simon could be completely unaware that Harry is also looking at that star. There's no jointness there yet, but they are both looking at the same thing. But if Simon does look at Harry, and so we've then got Harry and Simon gaze alternating between the object and each other, then we've got a possibility for kind of this to start to be joint, for this to start to be triadic, because we've now got a triangle. And so I think a really important kind of part of the operational definition of joint attention for me is that the individuals do at some point look at each other. So they need to engage in that mutual gaze. And ideally, so again, at this stage, this could still be done with very individualistic or selfish motivations. So it could be, if you imagine actually the star is food, and these are two competitors, you may be looking at the food, but also checking, well, what are you going for that? Am I safe to go for it? You may want to monitor both the thing of interest and other individuals. There may not be that sharing intention to anything. And so to really get at whether they understand they're doing this thing together and that this is a joint thing, what we're really ideally looking for is communication from both partners about the thing that they're interacting with. And at that stage, I think that's the most sure we can be when working with pre-verbal or non-linguistic animals, that they are doing this to communicate about this thing together and to engage together. Okay, so the question then that I wanted to ask is, to what extent is engagement in these different levels of joint attention event unique to humans? And when we looked at the literature, there are two big challenges. So firstly, operational definitions of joint attention are super diverse. So joint attention has been claimed in animals before, but if you look at what they actually measured, to me, it's not related to anything I've just talked about. So Ben Mocker and colleagues identified intentional communication that then leads to a joint activity, which in these birds, Arabian babblers, was joint travel. And Kim Bard and colleagues identified dyadic social interaction and called in chimpanzees and called that joint attention. But again, for me, doesn't quite get at what is important in terms of particularly the type of joint attention that is important for language in humans. The other challenge is that when we look at cross-species comparisons to date, generally non-comparable methods are used. So human infants always get to interact with another human. Their mother is usually either the partner or they're at least in the room with them. So they're kind of feeling familiar and relaxed. In contrast, virtually all of the work that's been done with great apes, they are expected to interpret the behaviour and communicative signals of a different species, that is a human experimenter, and it's often an individual that they're not super familiar with. They're often taken out of their social group to be tested individually. So I would argue at the moment the playing field is not level and that chimpanzees have been put at an unfair advantage in order to try and show this ability. So what I really wanted to try and do was some directly comparable research across species focused on them in their natural environments when interacting with conspecifics. And so this was my ERC-funded project where we had then 4 groups. So we had a cross-cultural sample of humans from the UK and Uganda. And then we had multiple populations of chimpanzees living in Kibale Forest in Uganda, and then multiple populations or groups of wild crested Siluese macaques living in their forest. And we studied mother-infant dyads in their home environment, so that meant home visits for all the humans and into the forest for all the primates. And we followed them from the age of 3 months up to 2 years, and as I explained to Nikki earlier, with the kind of COVID kind of interruption that then unfortunately just knocked off the end of the study. Okay, so how did we do this? So what we tried to do to give them kind of a directly comparable kind of stimulus with which they might want to share attention about was to project the moving light of a laser into the visual field of 2 individuals. And we aimed to present that laser for about 3 minutes so that they had time to exhaust their kind of individualistic response to it and to give them chance to then to be able to share attention about it if they wanted to. The nice thing about the laser was that we could distantly project it, so we could maintain the safe distance that you need to be working with primates in the wild, and we could also immediately stop the stimulus if other individuals came into the area, etc. So it was a really good way of testing this. So what did we find? So if we look at those different types of joint attention event, what we see is that if we looked at parallel attention, so remember that's just they're both looking at the laser. So there's no evidence of any jointness, but they're both looking at the laser at the same time. We see that this, and we did Bayesian models to kind of model all of this data, and we get really good support for this happening most in humans, then chimpanzees, and then macaques. If we look at another component of the kind of full-blown joint attention event, which is that they need to look at each other, again, in some monkey species, direct gaze is threatening. So we wanted to test whether that kind of component of joint attention, there was species difference. And really nice in these 3 species, the model said that there was no kind of important differences between species. So all species are looking at each other when the laser is present at roughly equal kind of rates. And then in terms of triadic attention, so they've both looked at the laser and then they've looked at each other within 3 seconds of disengaging with the laser. And here we find moderate evidence for this happening most in humans, more in humans than in chimps and macaques. And then when we got one individual to communicate, not both, again, we see the same pattern that there's some support for that happening more in humans than chimpanzees and macaques, but critically, we're seeing it happen across all species. And then our final level, our kind of gold standard of what we were really looking for is when both individuals communicate at that point where they look at each other. And so I just want to show you some video examples here. So this was rare across all groups. I should also say the human infants were 11 months old, and we chose that time point because it's after the 9-month revolution when they should start to engage in these type of events, but it's before most children start to point or to produce words, where we know then we're going to have really stark species differences. So this is an example of a full-blown shared attention event in a Ugandan mother and infant. Here the laser is green, and we slow it down at the point where they look at each other. So they're both engaged and looking at the laser. He's wobbling around in front of the infant, and then you will see the infant look up at the mother with a big smile, and the mother's also smiling and pointing at the same time. So the mother's giving 2 types of communication, and for the infant is smiling as their way of communicating about this cool new thing they've discovered. Okay, so that's what it looked like in one human dyad. Oh, no, there it is again. And so in the crested macaques, we also got an example of this. So this is Fat Man. I didn't name any of the macaques, an adult male. And this is Jack, who's an infant. And this is so here we've got a red laser. And what we see is at some point that they will both look at the laser, which ends up about here. And then at the point, so then you'll see Fat Man lean forward towards Jack. And at the point where he's leaning forward, he's lip smacking. So, and you will see Jack do a scalp retraction, facial expression, and then also lip smack back at him. Okay, so that's what you're trying to see.
Jack's trying to catch it.
So both looking at it now. So Fat Man just disengages and lip smacks at someone else there. But then he leans forward, lip smacks at Jack, scalp retracts. Sorry, the sound goes really odd when you slow the videos down. And then Jack goes and approaches Fat Man. Okay, so that's our crested macaque example.
Jack's gonna...
So with the chimpanzees, with the laser stimulus, we didn't get any examples of the full-blown shared attention event. However, because when we looked at the amount of engagement that the individuals were giving the laser, it was not equal across species. So humans found this moving laser just way more interesting than non-human primates. And we felt that the non-human primates, part of the trouble was that once they realised they couldn't pick it up, they didn't retain that much interest in it. And so for the non-human primates, we also presented them with objects that they could actually have a tactile interaction with. And the object that worked best across the species were these very highly polished mirror balls. And so this is Amelia, who's sitting very calmly by the mirror ball. Oh, sorry, you can't see the thing. This is Amelia, and the mirror ball is here. And Amelia will be approached by Denny, who is a juvenile who is unrelated to Amelia. And you will then see loads of communication between Amelia and Denny. And I think it's about the mirror ball. So you'll see facial expressions. So you'll see a silent bare teeth face, which the commentator calls a fear grin, so a face like that. You will see Amelia do a foot reach towards Denny, and then also an arm reach. You'll see Denny do an arm reach towards her, and you'll also hear the vocalizations commented. So I'm just going to let it play full speed for the first time, just to give you an idea of the whole interaction, and then we'll slow it down and watch the bit that I think is crucial in a minute.
I feel like Finch isn't overly interested in it. Looks like she's going to try to touch it. Denny's approaching. Looks like she's arm waving at it. Soft two from Amelia. Fear grin.
That's the
Denny's
foot reach.
approaching.
He embraces
Mounting
her.
Amelia. She still has a fear grin. That was some high-pitched, like, pants from Amelia. She's looking back at Sills, reaching out to Denny, holding his hand for reassurance. He's coming up to her. He also has a fear grin. She has a fear grin as well.
Okay, so let's now look.
Finch isn't overly
sorry,
interested
hang
in
on.
it.
Let's now look at that slowed down. So the critical point where we think, oh, hello, kind of our operational definition of joint attention occurs is when, so they've looked at the mirror ball and then they look at each other and then it's this reaching gesture that both of them do. And they also have the facial expressions on at the same time. Oh, sorry, didn't mean to do that. Right, so this is slower, so hopefully it'll be easier to see. Both just get momentarily distracted. That's Sills, Denny's mother, moving up the hill. Now she's looking at him, reaching out. He's still keeping his eye on the mirror ball. But now he's looking at her, reaching out. So that's the first one. Gives her another, then this is the second mutual gaze. And again, another reach out. There we go. Okay, so the conclusions that we're taking from this data set are that joint attention events, when rigorously defined, do occur in non-human primates, so they don't seem to be unique to humans. And it's also the first evidence of engagement in joint attention events in any kind of monkey species outside of the great apes. So although there seems to be, we're super excited to show that. However, what does still need to be explained is that when we tested them in a directly comparable way with the lasers, the rate of engagement in joint attention events was far greater in humans than it was in the other species. And so it's that we need to now think, okay, so why? Why are humans more motivated to use this capacity to engage in joint attention events than the non-human kind of counterparts? But it's really about explaining this quantitative difference now, rather than assuming it to be a qualitative difference in capacity. And so, again, I think it's really important that we continue to try and examine the evolutionary kind of pathway of the social cognition involved in language, as a complementary path to looking at the communication systems of our closest living relatives. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody who was instrumental in all of the lovely data that I've presented today. It was a huge team effort, and I'm very grateful to the site directors who allow us to go in to study their animals in the wild. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you. It was fantastic work. It's really nice. Just before we start with questions, we normally just have like a minute or so for people who want to leave before questions. And then we can continue. So now we can start the question there.
Thanks, Kate. That was really great. My question is, so it looked like there are differences in the joint attention events using the laser, and you were wondering whether if that could be a methodological, like something specific about using lasers. So with the balls, did you also give the balls to the humans?
No, we didn't, which I would have loved to have done, but just by the time we'd realised that we probably need to give the balls, our longitudinal sample were way beyond 11 months. So we kind of went with the lasers on our first approach, and then we just thought, but I mean, given that the humans gave us joint attention rigorously defined to the lasers. We thought, well, you know, they've shown us that we can do it in line with everything we expected. And again, there were no cross-cultural differences. We saw that across both populations. And so we just thought we would give the non-human primates that additional chance to show us if they were capable of it. So yeah, but you're exactly right. If we could go back again, that's, I think, the real trouble I've learned. It's the first longitudinal study I've done, and it's really annoying. There's no pause or rewind button. Yes.
In the perceptual studies with Kanzi, I was wondering, when you gave the call and then you give either objects or you give the emotions.
Yeah.
Did you also try trials where you have both emotions and objects, so snake and scare, and was there a preference in going towards the emotions?
It's a really good question. Again, ideally we would have loved to have done that and pitted them against each other directly. Unfortunately, so because his match to sample task is used really extensively, the directors were not keen for us to deviate from the kind of design where there is a single correct option. So they didn't want us to give him an option where actually 2 out of the 3 were correct, and it was kind of a choice.
Because it would ruin their training?
That was their concern, is that it would mess with his understanding of the task, and that it would disrupt the task that they need him to stay really consistently good at. And so again, you know, I'm not a site director of any of these places, and so I am kind of, you know, I have to do as I'm told by the people in charge. So I agree, it would have been awesome to have done that. So, you know, if we look at his performance on the 2, it does look like he's finding the match to the emotional label easier and faster, but he's still capable of the object-based one. And again, maybe that makes sense that he has, you know, his initial thing is to read, you know, to get a representation of, you know, what's the emotion, but then he has to retrieve kind of, you know, and that just takes a bit longer.
So why do you think with Kanzi it didn't work with foods?
So I think we haven't got, so I think, basically I don't think food calls in bonobos are functionally referential. So I think they need broader contextual cues in order to interpret those calls as food calls. So it's slightly weird. In most of the literature, there's lots of evidence of context-specific production, but without the playbacks. And in bonobos, it's an odd situation where we've got the playbacks, but actually we haven't got the original observational data to show that these are context-specific calls. So I think in the original playback study, it was obvious that there was going, you know, they were it's in captivity, and you know, they'd been trained that there were these 2 locations that produced food. Once they'd all gone inside, it was really likely there was food going to have been put in the 2 locations. And so I think when they're in the mood, you know, when they're thinking about food, they can then interpret those calls that they heard as referring to high or low quality. But when you just hear that call in complete isolation without any other contextual cues, I don't think it's functionally referential.
Because I wondered if there was a way of having it in a context that changed the food. Like, you know, there's a food that I know is very safe, I can easily get it in this place, and this other place might somehow be associated with risk or danger, and whether you might then see.
Yeah, it's a really interesting idea. The only other thing that I have thought about, the alternative explanation, is also then that, you know, food, so obviously for the alarm calls, we chose a specific threat reference, the object of a snake, because he knew snake really well and we could take a photo of a snake. So we knew he understood that, but obviously the calls actually were given to a much broader range of threats than just snake. But it's kind of the opposite with the food calls. So had we only recorded his group mates giving it to banana and then given banana as the referent, I don't know then whether he could have done that. So whether he was, if it very strongly means banana to him, maybe he's failing to extrapolate up to that kind of bigger categorical thing of food. That's one possibility that we thought about. So that would be interesting to go back and see if it's, that would be exciting if actually it's more specific and actually it was just using that broader category he was struggling with. But I find it weird that he also couldn't do surprise. So I mean, we had a whole series of further follow-up experiments based on the fact that he'd be able to do that, knock that one out of the park really easily. And then we were looking to see, how specific is his understanding? And unfortunately, it just failed at that very first hurdle. So I mean, we weren't expecting it at all. But that's science.
I know.
And working with animals and children. Oh dear, I seem to be doing both. Error.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. It was really amazing. I was thinking in joint attention, and I was thinking on what are the conditions, the critical conditions that needs to be met in order to joint attention be elicit or happen. So here in this experiment, there is a novel object that can elicit this joint gaze and then joint attention. But there is also I think it was an observational report in 2022 about there was a chimpanzee grooming another chimpanzee, and I think on a leaf there was on a leaf there was I think a bug or something like that,
and they show,
and then it shows yes.
So I've got the video if you want to see it. Should we just play that one? So everyone's on the same. Oh no, I just pressed the wrong button. That was an error. Hang on, let me press another button that's going to bring it back. So this is the video that we're talking about. Hang on, is it with us yet? Oh, it is. So this is the video. So this is the individual leaf grooming. This is her mother, and she finds something that she assumes is interesting, and then she holds it out to her mother. Her mother doesn't really pay attention, and then she puts it in front of her twice more, and as soon as her mum looks at it, she seems satisfied and withdraws it. So let's just have a look at that. Here she is, leaf grooming. Look at it, look at it, look at it. Look at it, there it is. Thank you. So I just thought we'd show it as another cool video. So that video.
Yeah. So my question is because in your experiment you use a novel object to I think enhance this joint or elicit this joint attention. But here in this video there is nothing novel, right? And so something that I am thinking is whether in order to we can observe this joint attention, maybe we need the individual needs the desire to share some information or knowledge or something like that, and whether we as scientists, how we can create those conditions to happen. I don't know.
No, well, I think it's a really kind of interesting point, and I think it probably speaks to the broader point that even though I think the non-human primates are doing it, maybe again the kind of context in which they're likely to do it may be slightly different from humans, and so although not necessarily, but in the chimp example, they were clearly uncertain about that object. And so, they want it. You've got Amelia doing this at the beginning. She wants to engage with it, but it's a bit scary, and then they are clearly uncertain about it. And so for the chimpanzees, maybe they aren't motivated to share attention about something unless it's to work out what should we do with this? Is this okay? Whereas in humans, it seems to be more positively valenced. It seems to be, wow, look at that, that's epic, rather than, oh, I'm not sure. What do you think about that? And so again, I think one of the real kind of barriers to us seeing joint attention in that more positively valenced context in the chimps is that chimps don't smile in the same way as we do. So they have, they have an open, relaxed face that they use during play to signal that they have a playful intention. But that is very constrained to the play context, and it usually requires physical kind of, engagement in play. So they need to be being tickled or chasing in order to express that face. And so they don't seem to have an expression of just positive emotion towards another that they can flexibly use as we can use a smile. And in that case, I actually think maybe we stand more chance with some of the monkey species, because monkey species, so the lip smacking that you saw Fatman and Jack engaging in, that is a much more, I think, flexible signal of affiliation, and maybe used in a more kind of homologous way to a smile. Whereas in chimps, lip smacking is ended up very, very highly constrained. They only lip smack when they're grooming another individual. So that's the only context in which we see lip smacking in chimpanzees. So yeah, lots and lots of things to think about but I think that thinking about what motivates, even in the instances we found, what motivated them and what the contextual differences are, and whether we need to look in slightly different contexts across species to see it more. Thank you.
Great talk, and it's always exciting to cancel a meeting and come to Sunway. Thanks for this. You know a lot of these in the wild, in the experiment in the wild. You know a lot about these particular individuals, right? You follow them, etc. So there will be other observational moments.
Yes.
Not design experiment moment where you can, mildly infer intentionality or other kind of things, which maybe you cannot put in the paper, but you can tell us, right? What is this convergence in these 2 years of two researchers looking at the monkeys? She knows these monkeys very well, and sees them all the time. So what are the other things that are not the hardcore alleged evidence?
So I think one, and again, we've got loads and loads of observational video data, so this is something else that we're trying to now kind of go back to look at. But certainly in terms of the kind of joint attention, one of the contexts that we're really interested in looking at with that is when they hear distant calls. And so it's an auditory stimulus, not a visual one, but that's okay. And you get situations there where they hear calls, sometimes they completely ignore them. Other times there's a huge amount of checking in with other individuals, starting to go, waiting, pausing, what are you doing? Are we going? Are we not? And again, I think that would be a really nice, and again, it's preparation for, are we going to do a joint action here? And what do we think about this call? Who, and presumably they're trying to work out, I'm assuming they know who it is because they're good at doing that, much better than us. But do we want to approach them? Do we need to move away from them? What are we doing about this? And so I think that's a really interesting context that we want to try and look at through all our videos to find instances of. In terms of intentional signalling, I definitely think the macaque lip smacking is intentional. And, I feel like if the gesture people had studied crested macaques rather than great apes, then lip smacking would be the intentional signal. I mean, I've even, with the crested macaques, obviously they have their crests, and I have seen a crested macaque grab another individual who was not facing them by the crest, turn their face and go at it. I mean, it could not be more, it couldn't be more intentional that he was doing that to communicate with that individual. And again, vocally, I've seen instances where the anecdote that started as looking at potential deception in their vocal communication. We had a female who was in full estrus. She was being heavily protected by the big dominant males. They'd all gone up to feed in a really good tree. She came down early and they just didn't really clock that she'd left. And then a young subordinate male was then really trying to solicit for a copulation with her. And he wasn't threatening her. He was just presenting what he had, as you do as a chimp. And she started screaming like she was being beaten up unbelievably severely. And of course, all the high-ranking males barreled down the tree, barreled through displaying. The young male went off screaming as she didn't have to copulate with him. That was the first, again, I have no doubt. She was receiving no aggression. So that was under intentional control. She chose to give a deceptive signal in that instance, and she seemed to have a clear goal, and she screamed until it was met, and those big males came, and the one she didn't want to copulate with went away. So yes, so like you say, there's lots of rich, those anecdotal observations, and they're so powerful for motivating then more systematic research. So I think it's important not to over interpret those individual anecdotes, but what I've tried to use them as motivation for. So then we started to look systematically at screaming, and whether the type of aggression matched what they were doing, and whether that mattered about who was around. So to me, but again, I don't think it's clear cut that all of their calls are used intentionally. I do get the impression that some of them are not under control and that some of them are just more arousal based expressions, but I have no doubt that some of them, and again, even within the same call type, So I think some screams, which they're given when they're being beaten up, just as much as we would scream in pain if we were in lots of pain. So sometimes I think they're not intentional, and other times I think they are. But yeah, sorry, that was a very long, rambly answer. I hope it was okay.
You answered 3 follow-up questions. So
I think one more question and then we'll probably need to wrap up.
Yeah, when I was thinking about the screaming example, it's a lovely one. And before you mentioned that, before Chris asked you the question, I was also thinking that sometimes in humans, joint attention can be manipulative.
Yeah.
Particularly, for example, when magicians perform. Our last Samuel speaker was a magician, and obviously I have worked for many, many years now, about 20 years. My tango partner is also a professional magician, as you know. And I was thinking about things like when the magician stands up and he goes, watch. So he's getting you to have joint attention with him, watch. And it's at that moment when you're looking there that they then do something deceptive. Now, okay, it's for entertainment purposes, so you could say it's potentially different perception from what's going on in a non-entertainment kind of deception. But I just wondered if there were examples of that you'd come across, or consistent with that idea of proving it might be.
Yeah, I guess not in chimps, but there's a really nice paper published on capuchins who are giving deceptive alarm calls in order to get access to food. So subordinate individuals who don't get access to the food platforms will give alarm calls, everybody jumps off, and then they jump on and eat the food. So that would seem they're trying to draw individuals' attention to an external entity that in that case doesn't exist.
Yeah.
To then, for their advantage. So yeah, I think it is a really, and again, with that, obviously what we don't know is whether that's just, maybe one time he did genuinely think there was a predator, but then it had this unexpected consequence. So then he learned, we don't know whether he understood why it worked. That kind of additional work would need to be done to show that he had an understanding and that part of it was intentional. But certainly on a surface level, that does seem to happen sometimes. So
Thank you.
that's cool.
Thank you so much. Sorry were there any other very quick questions?
I don't know whether quick, I'd rather stay till evening, but the bonobo community that you also tested on the information about the snake,
yes.
on the snake experiment, was the differences related somehow to the hierarchy?
No, so in the bonobos, we showed that they look towards individuals before giving the alarm calls, and that was a similar rate to the chimps. They gaze alternate, fewer individuals gaze alternated, but the ones that did it at a similar rate to the chimpanzees. But the big difference with the bonobos seems to be the goal. So we didn't find any evidence that they're stopping calling when others are safe. And so in bonobos, and again, it didn't seem related to their individual proximity to the snake or getting themselves safe. So we're not quite sure in the bonobos what their goal is. It could be that in the bonobos, it has more of a mobbing or recruitment function. So what they're trying to do is to get other individuals to come closer to them or to come closer to the predator in order to chase the predator away. I don't think that will work with snakes. So I'm not sure they're particularly well informed with that, if that is what they're trying to do. But at the moment, that's the big difference that we're trying to at the moment think about, whether we've got the data to try and test some alternative ideas for why they're doing it. But it doesn't seem to be given to kind of get others to be safe as it is in the chimps. So that seemed to be the main difference.
Should we thank Katie again for an amazing talk?
My computer behaved. Well done.
Here, all these are.
Yes. J-Lo, I did
clear as well.
Thank you.
The discussion of the system
Oh, great.
Yes.
Are there any other names of fish?
Yes,
Clearly you have to use the strongest example. But are there any other domains which is principal?
So, because I have done 2 days, 6 trials. The first time she got 3 correct, and yesterday 4
I mean,
correct,
in
and
terms
still
of
I am like
listening to joint calls, that is sometimes also their
yes.
So when they intend to start travelling,
So I'm happy.
exactly. Soft tube, that's kind of a double one, which means I intend to go, and then it's about kind of are you coming with me. So I think the communication in that. About the distant calls can be quite
Okay, so some of that can be.
So some of that can be.
Perfect.
Beyond that, grooming communication is mainly gestural and facial.
Calls are like culturally specific.
Other contexts that they both work a lot in is fighting.
That's logically distinct from
And I
fear
need
and fear.
about 2:15 to get back to club 2:30.
So
if you're happy to come for lunch, that's because
but I don't. The trouble is with those is that they're not. They're providing listeners with useful information about the ongoing interaction.
Nice.
But it's not external to the caller because the caller is part of that.
Yes.
So whether it's
quite referential in that way.
No. So it's So I mean, we've done experiments that show that listeners can understand the difference between aggressor screams and victim screams, and then within victim screams they can detect the difference between a scream given to really severe aggression versus mild aggression. So there's loads of useful information. And my again anecdotal kind of impression is that a chimpanzee listening to a load of screams can almost like picture the fight in their head.
Yes. I know it's anthropomorphic, but